From tracking cabs to clouds, have you thought about how location data has become an integral part of our everyday lives? If you're interested in knowing the science of location better, our Introduction to Geospatial Science and Technology course is the perfect starting point for you. Designed for curious minds from all disciplines, perfect for newcomers and working professionals, this course unpacks the science and real world applications behind geospatial technology. Don't miss the chance to learn from the best in the field. Applications closing on 7 June.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy from the Takshashila Institution. I am Astha, your host for today, and I serve as Program Manager for Defense and Foreign Affairs here at Takshashila. In this episode, we turn your attention to the rapidly shifting world of media, how information is produced, distributed, and consumed, and what that means for trust, public discourse, and democracy. Joining me today is Manoj Kewalramani, chairperson of the Indo-Pacific Studies program and fellow in China Studies at Takshashila. Before turning to research and policy, Manoj spent over a decade working as a journalist in India and China, giving him a unique perspective on how the media ecosystem has transformed over the years. We'll be unpacking the state of our media environment, the role of algorithms, the rise of emotional content, and what individuals can do to make sense of it all. So let's dive in. So, Manoj, thank you for coming in. And my first question to you is what, in your view, is the core function of news media in society today?
Hi, Asa. Thank you so much for having me. I think that's quite a straightforward question to answer, but obviously, our experience of media today makes us much more cynical of what that straightforward answer is.
Yeah.
So, conventionally, the straightforward answer of the news media's function would be that its job is to sort of observe, gather facts, investigate, and through that process also inform people. So, it's doing the job of putting together data, contextualizing it, and then informing people about what is relevant to their life, whether it's with regard to events that are happening around them or whether it's with regard to government policies and it's with regard to how the state is responding to developments. So that's the conventional job. And obviously, the purpose of all of this is to sort of echo public challenges, their needs, their desires, but also to empower them in terms of how they relate to the state. So it sort of had a bridge function where it would hold those in power to account. And the process of doing that was gathering information, contextualizing, questioning, but also informing the public about all of those factors so that public can also hold those people in power to account. So that, to me, is the function of the news media. Embedded in this is the idea that the news media is also an information broker, right? Because on a daily basis, there are 100,000 things happening, forget around the world in your city, right? As you step out of your apartment, there's heavy rain. There is the road is broken down. There's been an accident. There is a shortage of certain goods. Prices have gone up. So there's a whole lot of things that have happened. There's a crime that's taken place. At the same time, the American president is declaring 30% tariffs on something.
Sure.
So the job of the news media, therefore, is also to contextualize, but also to sort of be in some way the arbiter and the broker of that information, right? To be able to tell you why, out of the 100,000 things that are happening, these 5 demand your attention because your attention is finite. At one point in time, you can only do so many things, right?
Yeah.
And you can only consume so much information. So that's also a job of the news media, right? That it selects certain kinds of information. That's the editorial function. Conventionally, obviously, whether it was a newspaper or television or even radio, it had a limitation in terms of airtime and page constraints.
Yeah.
So it made this editorial function even sharper. today with digital media, digital news technologies, those have gone away, right? You don't have space constraints. You don't have, you can get the storage and you can keep adding in, so you can have a lot more information that you share. um, the constraint is your time,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and that is the constraint that therefore the media works on.
Yeah. So what I get a sense is that media has evolved over time. So what was a restricted news time
Hmm.
on like DD Metro versus like even airing news on media, now the time for the news consumption has increased. But
So those traditional restrictions are
yeah,
no longer there, right? For the
yes,
newspaper, it still is there, but I can read the Hindu in print, but I can read the Hindu online, and I can consume 25 more stories than what they could give me on the front page. Their web page could have 25 more stories,
right.
and in very, very different ways, right? So suddenly that space constraint is no longer there. The fact that you had only 18 pages, 20 pages, and there's an economics to those 20 pages,
Yeah.
which limited what you could do. But now on sort of the website, you don't have that problem. On the app, you don't have that problem. Print could only have text and images and graphics. But now you have videos.
Yeah.
Television was constrained by largely that it's an audiovisual medium, right? You can't read, you can't absorb, but digital sort of combines all of that.
That's
So
true.
some of those restrictions that were medium specific are gone. The only sort of restriction that to my mind remains today is the time of the consumer, right? So how do I, and that's therefore what I call the currency of the medium today.
Sure, sure. So, then coming on to the other question, what I have with you is what are the biggest forces that reshape the media ecosystem right now? What would they be?
I think technology for sure. I
Mhm.
think technology for sure in terms of just how it's, like I said, how it's reshaped what you can produce, how you can produce, how you can share. The impact of technology on availability of breadth of information and depth of information, sort of the democratizing function of technology, so to say. For example, in the past, this information broking function that I talked about, where editors would decide certain things, it's in some ways gone, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it still is there, but it's also gone in the sense that today you have 50 new podcasts, YouTubers sharing information, um, taking from news platforms and contextualizing it, right? So they are performing editorial functions, they are challenging editorial decisions. So that to me is a big change in terms of how, and this is not a new change in sense in the last few years. It's probably a 15, 17-year old gradual change that's taken place in the news environment. So to me, technology is a big factor in terms of how news is produced, how news is consumed, how a distribution of news takes place, and who can make decisions on news media and news content, and who can disseminate that. I think that to me that's probably the biggest change. Of course, there's a whole range of other factors, from the political environment that you operate in, the limitations of the economic model of the news business, which even today is predominantly advertising, consumption habits of individuals. All of those, I think, are factors that impact the media.
So, I understand that technology has democratized the way we get the information, but then I really think of that democratizing to a level is fine because now is the reporting still has factual content in it, because when it's perspective driven, it kinds of takes that toll over how we are reporting certain kind of news.
Yeah, I mean, look, so there is a, you know, many years ago, NDTV used to have this show called, I don't know if they still have it, but I remember, because I don't watch television as much anymore, but they used to have this show called The Big Fight. A promo for the big fight, and I'm saying this because I used to work in NDTV many years ago. A promo for the big fight used to have this lovely quote from Shabana Azmi during one of the episodes, which was that the malaise of Indian society is that we have far more opinion than facts.
Right.
Right. And that's in some ways the case of the news environment today, right? Because of this system of democratization. So I think the democratization has been good. It has challenged certain conventional notions and conventional norms. It has shaken up certain ivory towers, and I think that's good. The challenge that it presents for consumers is that it's required us to be far more responsible in terms of trusting what we consume, far more responsible, far more discerning. It's created an abundance of information, but it's also created what you said, a set of sort of perverse information. So I think it has imposed costs on us as
Yes.
consumers that we
Yes.
need to be much more discerning. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that is good in the sense that it requires us as news consumers to exercise some of the editorial functions of thinking through what we are consuming. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's bad in the sense that a lot of people might not want to think through because it's effort. But I think it's a good thing. People should think about what they're consuming. People should think about some things before you share them to your family group or your friends group on WhatsApp. Think about the content, give it a moment. The challenge is that I think we are succumbing to speed and being overwhelmed rather than pausing and taking a think about things, right? And I think that's what people should be doing. So I don't think the democratization process has been necessarily bad. It's created perverse outcomes, but I think that it shifted the onus of responsibility on people, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing.
Sure, that makes sense. So, when people are practicing this right of being a part of the news that they're reading, how would you put this as that technology, especially algorithmic curation, changed how people access and engage with the news?
Yeah, I think that is a big challenge, right? Because if you are increasingly caught in a bubble,
Yeah.
It's difficult to break out of it, and it happens to everybody. It's obviously requires tremendous effort to break out of the bubble. I don't think we necessarily even understand how certain in sometimes algorithms trap us in certain bubbles. um, I think the first step to sort of dealing with that is to being cognizant of the fact that the algorithms create these information bubbles and information echo chambers, and you can be locked in that. There is a role for, to my mind, even regulation to play in this, where regulation can deny the creation of some of these algorithmic bubbles, or at least require the information to be much more diverse, require things like verification of information, fact checking by the platforms itself, not by the government. I don't think government should be in the business of fact checking per se. It can clarify whenever it needs to clarify some things, but I don't think government should be fact checking things or have a fact checking bureau. I think that it places onus on platforms to be much more transparent. And I think we as people should demand that. It places onus on individuals to be much more cognizant of the bubbles. But that's a challenge, right? Because algorithms are tailored to grab your attention and maximize that. Like I said, that time that you spend is the currency, right? So your attention is the currency. And algorithms, the job of an algorithm is to keep you there, to keep you engaged. To that extent, it is likely to serve you things that agree with your viewpoints, and or it is likely to serve things that animate you to engage on the platform.
Yeah.
And I think both of those require us to understand firstly what's happening, and then to step back and take measures to mitigate some of those ill effects, right? One of the best things that you can do is you can just diversify your news consumption, right? You can diversify the consumption of information from different sources, right? And I think that actively doing that is useful. That doesn't mean that you do some sort of balancing, that if I've read some left leaning report, now I'm going to read some right leaning report. It means diversify the consumption of sources, of news from different sources, and also try to learn to distill fact from opinion in the reportage that you're engaging.
Sure. I think we as readers also are somewhere divided between what do we like. And the problem comes in when we are reading something that we like gives us a confirmation bias.
Yeah.
Oh, what I thought is the right way to think about it. And when we read something contrary to it, we are not very comfortable.
Yeah.
So we tend to we ourselves are somewhere responsible
Exactly.
for fueling
Yeah.
what we think.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that it requires appreciation of what's happening and active efforts to try and break through some of this stuff.
Sure. So, are platforms today more powerful than traditional newsrooms in shaping public opinion? Would you say that?
Yes and no. I mean, I think the traditional newsrooms, I think, okay, I grew up in the 80s where there was only Doordarshan, and everything you consumed came predominantly from Doordarshan on television. But yes, you had print newspapers.
I remember Aakho Dekhi was one of those
Exactly.
news.
So the impact of that of monopoly
Hmm.
is tremendous, right? So in some ways, yes, platforms have tremendous power because they are able to um, leverage network effects. They are able to leverage reach. They are able to leverage, you know, tailored preferences based on algorithms and things like that. They're able to do a whole lot of other things that, say, a traditional news network could not do.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
a newspaper did not necessarily, assess whether you liked certain kinds of stories. I mean, there were metrics, but it's very difficult to do that sort of assessment, right? I mean, TRP is one such assessment, right?
Yes.
In television,
Yes.
that if you're getting high ratings for a particular show, you double down on those kinds of things much more. So yes, you can do that, but it's at a far more rudimentary level than what platforms with sort of algorithmic power can do. So yes, they are powerful in that sense that they are able to potentially capture much more engagement. Yes, but in terms of shaping public opinion, I still think that in India, I think what we call mainstream media, sort of traditional print and television media,
Yes.
still has a tremendous role to play in terms of how a large chunk of the population thinks. I think the overwhelmingly large chunk of the population thinks. I think just data on where people access their information will tell you that television and print maybe less so, but television commands significant capability. Also, I think what we don't get in this is that the binary of platform versus traditional is slightly, you know because traditional media, mainstream media, also leverages platforms.
Right.
So a lot of amplification of content is happening through these social media platforms, and traditional media is adapting to them. So I mean, the classic example is during the pandemic. We were all cooped up in our house, and my parents were with me, and there was nothing to do. We were six people in a house with nothing to do, and lots of work to do. At the end of the day, I could see a lot of the content that my parents were consuming at that point of time. Particularly with regard to the whole Sushant Singh Rajput death story. It was essentially clips of mainstream media coverage, sensationalized mainstream media coverage in clip formats circulating on WhatsApp and other messaging platforms. So I think that mainstream media, traditional media also leverages platforms, and platforms also leverage mainstream media content, and therefore you saw this whole battle in Australia around who should get the revenue.
Yes.
Should it be should platforms be sharing revenue with news providers for the content, right? Because it's that content that's also driving platforms, right? So I think that I can't sort of put a finger on where the scale of the balance of power is, but I would say that traditional media still has a tremendous role to play in setting narratives.
So, if I think of information as a product, uh, we make products which are emotional to us. So, why is emotional content dominating our feeds? And what does that do to the quality of information we consume? Because in the recent things that happened in our nation, we as nation have faced, I was on social media platform, various, even though I don't engage with, I was, because I was like, I want to be updated about this. So, and every content that I read was such right, was really riling up the population, is what I saw. And full of emotions, like everyone wanted to throw off their passionate emotions about things they're reading. So what would you say about that, like the quality of information that we consume and that riles up every bit of us?
I think it's, in some ways, it's just natural, right? If your time and your attention is the primary currency, uh, what makes you spend that currency
Yes.
is, yes, intellectual advancement and things like that. But what's the lowest common denominator for you to spend that currency is when you're emotionally invested. So therefore, what news content is doing is that it's, partly it's important because your job as a news professional is to connect the story, which might be abstract, which might be distant. So, for example, it might be a report about the failure of parliament, a particular law, particular discussion between politicians of something in terms of the electoral outcomes. It could be a story about sewage. It could be a story, so sort of civic issues. It could be a story about crime. It could be an uplifting story about somebody achieving something. So this is the broad sort of swath of news reports that you might do, right? In each of these, as a journalist, my job is to make you in some way informed, yes, but also care.
Yes.
Right. So, like I said, one of the jobs is to echo and empower. To empower and echo, I need to also make you care. Right. You need to feel like this matters to me. Otherwise, why am I spending my time on it? Right. Why am I spending my time on?
So it has to be a personal.
I have to make it relevant to you.
Okay.
Now, whether it is I make it relevant to you by tear jerking emotion, or whether I make it relevant to you by explaining to you the context of why this matters to you, to your wallet, to your daily life, to your security, so on and so forth. In an ideal world, I would want the journalist to focus on how something matters to you in these levels, right? From an economic point of view, from a security point of view, from a personal safety point of view, from your personal growth point of view, all of those things.
Yes.
But that's hard to do. That's hard to do. It's easier to make it matter emotionally.
Yes.
Right? If I can tug at heartstrings and make you connected. Also, if I can do that, you are likely to respond, much more quickly, sort of type A response, where you're likely to immediately react to something rather than think and respond, which means that I'm likely to get much more engagement from you.
Okay.
Like if I'm doing a TV show on rains in Bangalore and the failure of infrastructure year on year, and we have those TV shows year on year in every city in the country now. The way, if you listen to what the people are calling and saying, there is seldom anybody calling and saying, hey, look, you know what, this is what I think we can do better. This is where I think we've done better. And if you actually look at the data, this has improved or this has worsened and things like that. What you will essentially hear is people calling and venting.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And the objective of that show is to allow you to vent, because only when you are emotionally engaged is when you will come and talk. So if your attention is the currency, the easiest path to make you spend that currency is by emotionally engaging you. And therefore, a lot of the content is about emotional engagement rather than necessarily intellectual engagement. Because intellectual engagement can allow you to create some distance. Emotional engagement completely crushes that distance, and therefore you will be much more engaged. So that's why more content is emotional, although I don't like the idea of it.
So correct me if I'm wrong here. So how do we blur the line between something being fiction and something being non-fiction? Because non-fiction comes with facts, and like you said, it fuels your intellectual part of it, and it also kind of distances you from an issue that you're reading about. So why are we fictionalizing and context, like in the name of contextualizing, we are actually fictionalizing the stories that we are actually getting to?
I mean, you may be fictionalizing it, or you may be just amplifying the emotional content. So the fictionalizing bit of it goes away from reportage, right? It becomes fiction, right? So when you suddenly start, what we saw during the India-Pakistan brief conflict that we had, a lot of it was fiction. But there are real stories, right? So there is real stories of, in border areas, in parts of Punjab where, a house has been bombed, or a family that was traveling in the middle of the night, got hit and they got injuries, telling their story. That's not fiction. That's true. I can tell their story by just keeping them as a statistic, by saying that 3 people in the family got injured. They are being treated at so-and-so hospital. They were traveling. This is what happened. It was sudden and they got injured. I can amplify the emotional content of it. I can even go to the hospital and see them recovering and just briefly talk to them, say how you're doing, it was sudden, whatever. That can be one part of the story. That's just reporting the facts. The other part of the story can be to talk about their personal pain, their agony. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing in that context, because it sends the message of what conflict can do to people, right? How painful conflict can be. Otherwise, we become distant from it.
Sure.
So in some cases, that emotional connection may be useful. Fictionalizing obviously never is useful. But in some cases, that emotional connection is useful and is necessary.
Yeah.
In some cases, when you rile people up to the extent, and again, the Sushant Singh Rajput death case is a classic example of this, where people who have nothing to do with the movie industry were talking about nepotism. Whether nepotism is a problem or not is secondary. It doesn't affect my life. But I spent 6 hours on Twitter arguing with some other random people about nepotism. Right? So that's what I mean, that, that bit of riling up where something where you forget that none of this has any relation to me really, right? But it's about connecting it to something in my life. I wanted this thing and I worked in this company for 5 years and I was set for a placement, but then the boss's cousin's son came, and so it builds this idea of, this injustice is also your injustice.
Yeah.
And then you get riled up and you sort of share 50,000 things on Twitter. So that's where I think the problem lies.
Sure.
And I think, again, at the end of the day, it's for the consumer to respond to that rather than because if you are going to engage, the market impulse that you're giving the producer is this works.
So you create a ripple and you get a ripple back is how it works.
Yeah.
So what do you think is driving the growing distrust in mainstream media?
I think a lot of things. I think partly it is the fact that there is a frustration with the style of news reporting to begin with.
Yeah.
Right? Particularly on television. I think the style of news reporting is frustrating. The howling, yelling, fighting, all of that is problematic.
Yeah.
I think there's also the case that there is low trust because you see the media across the world, this is not just in India, as having partisan positions, right? And adopting partisan positions. I think a lot of that has become embedded in public imagination, that across the board, certain media outlets are partisan, and therefore you look at the reporting from a partisan lens. Now, a newspaper may be left-leaning, right-leaning, whatever. Maybe go through the report, see whether the report has frailties, where it has strengths, without prejudicing yourself to the, to the platform. Of course, I would make a distinction between platforms which have a consistent tendency to report falsely without acknowledging. Now, in reporting, misreporting can happen.
Yes.
You can mess up some facts. You can mess up something. There is a difference between misinformation and disinformation, where the other two have a lot to do with much more purposeful types of actions. I think if you see a media outlet acknowledging errors in reporting, I think you should appreciate that and you should respect that. Whereas those which double down, I think it's something that to be said for it. So I think there are several factors as to why trust has gone down. A lot of it has to do with relevance of what's being talked about in the news to my daily life. Right. People may be drowning in a flood, yet instead of dealing with civic issues in that sense, you're discussing some random things. The relevance of the kind of stories to people's daily experiences matter. I think so. There are several factors why trust has gone down, but I think a lot of it has to do with style, beliefs about partisanship, and whether what is being covered matters to my life.
So when I hear you talk about all these way information is brought in light, I just think of some conversations we have is like there is some other big thing happening, but we are reporting something else and something else is getting underreported, right? So how do we understand that at this point of time this is the most important news that should reach larger population, and this is something, how do we decide which is more important, which is not? So
yeah, see, I think that's part of editorial function, right? You as an editor, and so therefore there will be certain amount of subjectivity in that. It can't be objective, right? So there will be an editorial function that you will take into account where you will decide what I think is much more relevant, and that's why editors matter. Also, another way in which this problem that you described has gotten addressed is by hyper-localization of news.
Okay.
So, there was a time where you had just one national media or national newspapers.
Yeah.
You look at India today, it has incredible number of newspapers and publications. It has incredible number of digital publications which are so niche and so localized in terms of not region but issue specific.
Yes.
Right. And then you look at television, it has gotten hyper localized. You've got channels in multiple languages. You've got channels focusing on specific regions. So there is hyper localization. And again, this is not a new trend. When I started my career in media, my first journalism job was in Bombay with a hyper local newspaper that served only the suburbs of Andheri to Bandra.
Okay, that's
so that's it, right?
Yeah.
So only that bit, and it was run from a very small, one-room place with a total staff of 5 people. So hyper-localization is one way that this problem gets solved, and that so you as a consumer can decide, right? If I am interested in only my locality, my life, and my region, my city, whatever. I'm interested in hyper local news.
Okay.
If I am interested in national issues, I will subscribe to a Hindustan Times, Times of India, whatever, right? And I know that Hindustan Times will predominantly focus Delhi or whatever. If I'm interested in entertainment, I'll get Times of India only to read Bombay Times.
Yeah.
Right. So you as a consumer have tremendous choices, and this I think is across all mediums. It's across print, it's across television, it's across digital.
Right. So, in an environment of ideological silos and curated realities, what does it take to stay informed responsibly?
So that to me is the sort of big thing, right? And uh, it's difficult. First thing that it takes is a lot of energy, and I think you as an individual must decide how much energy you want to spend on some things. You can't really grasp everything.
Okay.
So one maybe good thing to have is to have a reliable network of people whom you discuss, whom you talk to, right? Not people who may necessarily agree with you, but who share somewhere similar sets of values, and not values in terms of political values, but values in terms of, uh, openness, transparency, free exchange, things like that, where you can, without prejudice, have a conversation. I think that matters in your own personal life. And I think, like, for us, I think, the environment at this institution, at Takshashila, serves that purpose, right? There are often times where we may be discussing something, a news development, uh, which I have no idea about, because I don't have the bandwidth to follow it, right? My life revolves around following certain things. I can only do that much. I can't know everything. But there are 10 other people who follow 10 other different domains.
Yeah.
So we have a conversation about that. I listen to their opinions. If it matters that much to me to have an opinion on that, then I will go and do my legwork on it. If it doesn't matter to me to have an opinion on that, it's fine.
Yeah.
I can just absorb their insights and let it park it somewhere, till whenever the time comes that it matters enough for me to go and look at it. So that decision of what matters to you,
Yes,
is, I think, something that you must take, right? So it matters to me. Bollywood gossip matters to me, so I spend a lot of time on it. But maybe certain aspects of Indian politics, I don't care about, right? So I don't necessarily follow it with that degree of diligence. So that's the first thing to me, is to first decide what matters to you and how much you want to look at it. I talked about the different elements of how the news media functions. I have a framework of what the news media and platforms are trying, what their approach is, and I call it as EAT. So they are activating emotion, they crave your attention, and to do all of that, they serve you tailored content. Your job is to diet, right? So your job is to not eat as much. Your job is to diversify your news consumption, investigate, but investigate on what matters
Yes.
to you enough, enable. So if you think some people are doing objective quality work, you must enable those media outlets, because, like I said, revenue is a huge challenge in the media business, and the revenue model is at the heart of a lot of the problems that we face. And finally, you must temper your responses. Just like you must investigate given the time. If you're 24 hours in the day and you want to take your time to investigate everything, please do so. But if you don't, also temper how you respond to something. Give yourself a moment to absorb what you've read. Don't immediately read something and say, I must share this on Twitter or X or Facebook or WhatsApp, and I must give my 2 bits of information immediately. Give it a moment, think about it. Think about the nature of it. Even if you need to respond, think about the nature of your response. Are you reacting? Are you responding? Have you thought it through? I think that sort of guardrails for ourselves are important. So there's a certain amount of tempering of our own things. And I mean, to my mind, you don't need to have an opinion on everything. I don't have an opinion on everything. And I don't think it is necessary to have an opinion on everything. So that's how I sort of approach some of these things.
Sure. So I really like this idea of not having opinion about everything.
Yeah.
Because when I started studying public policy, I was always worried about, I don't have an opinion about things these guys are talking about. But then it also gave me that space to learn and to understand it. So basically, not react but respond.
Yeah.
And that is how it actually helped me grow in terms of thinking. But I want to understand, how do you overcome a barrier when you are not agreeing with certain things. Like you said, you diversify how you consume, how you read media, and you will come across a barrier. Oh, I don't believe in this thing, but this seems logical and factual. So how do you overcome that? That has been my challenge.
Yeah, I mean, look, in the course that we teach in GCPP, at one point of time in the course, I quote a great Indian philosopher called Hrithik Roshan, who on an episode of Coffee with Karan had said something to the effect of, orange is not necessarily the most beautiful color in the world. It's just that the painter has decided to paint a sunset. So that's how I approach the media sometimes, where I know that different media outlets, based on their incentives, imperatives, predilections, will cover a story from a particular angle. Right? So then the more you consume, the more adept you become at somewhat deciphering the angle that has been taken. So first thing is that, right? So don't be cynical. Understand what Hrithik Roshan is saying. Look at media outlets from the point of view of their imperatives, their incentives, their predilections, and then read the content. Whatever is factual from it, you take, and the facts can be verified. So if I have enough investment in the story, I will go and I will verify the facts. Otherwise, it doesn't bother me, right? It's okay I'll have a coffee table conversation with somebody, and if somebody presents something different to me, I will listen to it and I will quietly absorb what they're trying to say, if it makes logical sense to me. If it really gets me up, I will go and find out more about it. Otherwise, it's okay. You encounter 50 different bits of information in a day, let it pass. If you want to verify facts, there can be various ways of verifying certain facts, right? It depends on what the fact is. If the fact is around unemployment numbers in India, government and different agencies put out certain sets of numbers. I will go back to those. Now, I know that those may be incomplete, right? So I will try and talk to people who have much more experience in analyzing that data to try and say, hey, look, how do I understand this? So try to understand from them, how do I understand that particular factor? Try to diversify, from them, try to grasp frameworks to think about the particular issue. So do that sort of things, but depending on how much it matters to my life and work, right? I'll give you a last example of something that doesn't matter to my life and work, but I'm still very invested in it. There's this recent controversy around Deepika Padukone stepping away from a movie of Sandeep Reddy Vanga. And then in the morning, I was watching a video about how there are so many contested narratives. Now, that's fun for me to enjoy. I don't develop an opinion about Deepika Padukone or Mr. Vanga either way. It's just something that I'm enjoying. I don't need to be invested enough to share online and to talk about this. It's just something that I'm enjoying. And I will never really know the facts because I'm never really in the position of either of them. And this is a PR battle going on. So I must recognize that also. Despite that, I will say that I support Deepika Padukone. But yeah, anyway, irrespective, the point is that some things are just immaterial to your life.
Right.
So, okay, dip your toes, have a little bit of fun. Don't let it bias you about issues. Understand that there are broader things at play. But some things that matter to you. Spend the time and effort to try and talk to people, diversify the sources from which you consume information, but talk to people who studied that particular issue for a longer period of time and maybe grasp from them frameworks and ideas to think about an issue. Don't take their authority on face value, but grasp from them how to approach certain issues. And if it matters enough to you, spend time on it. If it doesn't, it's okay.
Sure. Thanks, Manoj. That was really, really fun talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.